All right, so today we're going to be looking into something that's sparked a lot of conversation.
Yeah.
The decision to stop issuing U.S. passports with an X gender marker.
Mm.
And we're going to be kind of looking at all the ripple effects from that decision.
Yeah.
It touches on the law,
Mm.
society,
Mm-hmm.
and global perceptions as well.
Right.
We'll unpack all of that and even explore some surprising international comparisons
Interesting.
along the way.
Okay, well, it's interesting here how something most people see as just a travel document
Yeah.
can become so central to these questions of identity and even legal recognition.
That's very true, isn't it? I mean, just imagine needing a document that's supposed to represent you to the world,
Yeah.
but it doesn't accurately reflect who you are. I
Right.
mean, that's got to be incredibly frustrating.
It is absolutely, and that's where the potential for discrimination comes in.
Right.
One of the sources that we have, actually a study from the National Center for Transgender Equality, found that nearly a third of transgender people who've shown an ID
Yeah.
with a name or gender that didn't match their presentation,
Okay.
they were denied service or even harassed.
Wow. That's a pretty stark statistic.
Yeah,
It really highlights the very real impact that this kind of policy can have on people's lives.
for sure.
And it makes me think about the 14th Amendment,
Yeah,
which guarantees equal protection under the law.
right.
So could removing the X marker actually be considered discriminatory?
It's a question a lot of legal experts are grappling with, and to
Yeah.
really kind of get at the heart of that, we need to take a closer look at the Equal Protection Clause,
Okay.
which basically says states can't deny anyone within their jurisdiction
Uh-huh.
the equal protection of the laws.
Okay.
That means the government has to have a really good reason
Right. Bruh.
if they're going to treat different groups of people differently.
So in this case, would the argument be that the government doesn't have a strong enough justification
Yeah.
for denying non-binary individuals that option of an X marker on their passport?
Exactly. And this is where the Bostock v. Clayton County case gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Even though it was about employment discrimination,
Uh,
the core principle from that ruling
yeah.
could have implications for this passport issue as well.
Okay.
The Supreme Court basically said in Bostock
Yeah.
that discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity
Okay.
is a form of sex discrimination,
Uh-huh.
which is prohibited under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act.
Okay, so help me connect the dots here.
Sure.
How could a case about employment discrimination
Yeah.
possibly apply to passports?
Well, the argument goes that if denying someone a job because they're transgender
Yeah.
is a form of sex discrimination,
Mhm.
then denying someone a passport that accurately reflects their gender identity
Okay.
could also be considered sex discrimination.
Right.
After all, both situations involve treating someone differently because of their sex.
That's a pretty compelling argument.
Yeah.
And the implications actually go beyond just equal protection, don't they? The sources also mention something called the Administrative Procedure Act, or APA.
Yes, the APA.
So can you break that down for us?
Essentially, it's like a rule book for how the federal government has to make policy changes. It's meant to prevent agencies from making arbitrary decisions
Right.
or capricious decisions without proper justification or public input.
Okay.
So it's all about process.
So how does the APA fit into this whole passport situation?
Well, there's a question of whether the rollback of the X marker
Right.
was done according to the APA's guidelines.
Uh-huh.
For instance, did the agency properly consider the impact this change would have on non-binary individuals? Was there a public comment period where people could weigh in?
Yeah.
If not, the decision could potentially be challenged on procedural grounds.
So it's not just about the decision itself.
Right.
It's also about the process.
Exactly.
Kind of like how you can have a great idea for a cake, but if you don't follow the recipe,
Right.
it might not turn out so well.
That's a great analogy. And this is where things could get really interesting.
Okay.
If legal challenges are actually brought forward, it could end up going all the way to the Supreme Court.
Wow. Okay, so we've got this legal battle brewing.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to kind of zoom out a little bit and remember that this isn't just about these kind of abstract legal principles.
Right.
It's about real people's lives.
Of course.
One of the articles you shared talks about the psychological impact
Yeah.
of not having your gender identity recognized, especially on something as important as a passport.
It's crucial. Think about it. Your passport is this document that allows you to travel,
Right.
to experience the world. but it's also a form of identification,
Yeah,
a way of confirming who you are.
for sure.
And for non-binary individuals, having that identity denied or invalidated even symbolically
Yeah.
can have a profound impact on
Okay.
their sense of self and well-being.
It's almost like saying you don't exist.
Yeah.
Or at least we don't recognize your existence as legitimate.
Right.
And the sources highlight how this can lead to increased anxiety, depression, even feelings of isolation.
For sure.
It's like being told you're not welcome.
Yeah.
Not just in other countries,
Right.
but by your own government.
Exactly. And that's not even considering the practical implications for those who do want to travel.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, imagine you're non-binary and you're traveling to a country where maybe they haven't quite caught up to the idea of gender diversity.
Uh-huh.
You're already facing potential misunderstanding,
Right.
maybe even danger just by being yourself.
Right. And then imagine your passport, the very document that's supposed to help you navigate all of that,
Yeah.
adds to the confusion.
Right, exactly.
Because it doesn't reflect your true identity.
Right, that X marker could have been a subtle but really important signal,
Yeah.
potentially helping to avoid uncomfortable situations or even risky ones.
Right.
You know, it's about more than just convenience. It's about safety and peace of mind.
Right. It makes me think about the bigger global picture.
Yeah.
It feels like the U.S. is moving in one direction on this,
Uh-huh.
while a lot of other countries are moving in the opposite direction,
Huh.
becoming more inclusive, not less.
It's a fascinating contrast, isn't it?
It is.
I mean, Canada, New Zealand, Germany, Austria,
Wow.
they've all implemented X gender markers or other third gender options on their passports.
Mm.
It's becoming increasingly common
Okay.
for countries to acknowledge that gender isn't always as simple as male or female.
So where does this leave the U.S. on the world stage?
Yeah.
I mean, it's got to impact how we're perceived, especially on all these issues of human rights.
It definitely raises questions.
Yeah.
You know, the U.S. has historically positioned itself as a champion of freedom and equality,
Yeah, for sure.
but this decision could be seen as out of step with that image,
Right.
potentially aligning us more with countries that are more resistant
Right.
to recognizing LGBTQ plus rights.
It's almost like we're sending mixed signals to the world. On one hand, we say, hey, we're this beacon of liberty.
Right.
But on the other, we're making it harder for some of our own citizens to travel safely,
Yeah.
to be recognized for who they are.
And this inconsistency isn't just playing out on the international stage either.
Where else?
Think about what's happening within the U.S. itself.
Yeah.
We have over 20 states
Uh-huh.
that already allow an X on driver's licenses.
Wow.
And a growing number of businesses are also adopting more inclusive gender options.
It's almost like we're creating this two-tiered system within our own country,
It is.
where on a state level or even in the private sector,
Right.
you might have your gender identity recognized.
Mm-hmm.
But then when it comes to federal documents, it's a different story.
Exactly. And that discrepancy can create real practical headaches
Uh-huh.
for individuals.
Yeah.
Imagine trying to, open a bank account
Right.
or rent an apartment. You're constantly having to explain why your documents don't match.
Yeah.
Potentially facing confusion, skepticism,
Yeah.
or even discrimination.
It's gotta be exhausting,
It is.
demoralizing.
Yeah.
You're constantly having to justify your existence
Yeah.
to prove that you are who you say you are.
It really highlights how these seemingly small changes to policy can have such a ripple effect
Yeah.
on people's lives.
Right.
It's not just about these abstract legal arguments or political posturing. It's about the real challenges
Sure.
that people face trying to navigate a world that doesn't always recognize
Yeah.
or respect their identity.
Okay, so we've talked about the legal battles, the global implications, the practical consequences. But what about the future?
Right.
Is there any hope that things might change?
But the future of the X marker in the U.S. is definitely uncertain.
Yeah.
There are several factors that could really shape how this plays out.
Oh,
One is the legal challenges we discussed earlier.
right.
If those cases make it to the Supreme Court,
Uh-huh.
its ruling could set a major precedent
Yeah.
for how gender identity is recognized and protected
Okay.
under U.S. law.
So the courts could potentially force a change?
Yeah,
Even if the current administration is resistant.
absolutely. That's a really powerful check on executive power.
And then there's also the political landscape.
Mm-hmm.
A future administration could easily reverse this decision,
Right.
especially if they have a more inclusive stance on LGBTQ plus rights.
Exactly.
So a lot hinges on who holds power
Yeah.
and what their priorities are.
Right.
It's a reminder of how much elections matter,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to issues like this.
And let's not forget about the power of grassroots movements.
Right.
Advocacy groups, especially those representing transgender and non-binary individuals, they're incredibly passionate and vocal.
Yeah.
They're not going to let this issue fade away quietly.
They're going to keep fighting for recognition.
Yes.
And for the right to have their identities accurately reflected
Exactly.
on those official documents.
Unofficial documents.
And it makes me think about the international pressure, too.
Yeah.
You know, you mentioned how many other countries are moving toward greater inclusion.
Right.
Could that influence your U.S. policy?
It's certainly possible the U.S. often tries to present itself as a global leader on human rights.
Yeah.
But this decision really puts us at odds with many of our allies.
It's almost like the rest of the world is saying, hey, America,
Yeah.
you're falling behind catch up.
Exactly. And that kind of pressure, especially from countries that we see as peers,
Yeah.
can be pretty persuasive.
It feels like there's this tension between this push for greater inclusion and the resistance to change.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, where does this resistance come from?
Well, one factor is this broader cultural debate about gender identity.
Okay.
You know, some people see recognizing non-binary identities as a threat to traditional values or an attack on the concept of biological sex. It's often framed as part of this culture war,
Okay.
which can make it really difficult to have a nuanced and productive conversation
Right.
about the issue.
It's frustrating, isn't it? It feels like sometimes we get so caught up in these ideological battles that we lose sight of the real people who are being impacted.
Absolutely.
Those policies.
And that's why it's so important to keep talking about these issues.
Yeah.
To share stories, to educate ourselves and others.
Yeah.
Because ultimately this is about creating a world where everyone feels seen,
Right.
heard, and respected for who they are.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
The legal battles, the social and psychological impact, the global perspective, and the potential for future change. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about the economic and administrative realities of this decision.
You're right. We can't ignore the practical side of things.
Yeah.
Policy decisions always have consequences.
For sure.
And it's really important to understand what those might be.
So let's get down to brass tacks.
Okay.
Thousands of passports with the X gender marker were already issued. Under the previous administration, what happens to those now?
It's a bit of a logistical nightmare.
Really?
The State Department could potentially require those individuals to get their passports reissued.
Wow.
Which would be a huge administrative burden.
Yeah.
And of course, it would come with a hefty price tag.
Right.
Both for the government and for the individuals who have to pay for a new passport.
That's not to mention the inconvenience.
Right.
The potential stress for those who have to go through the whole process again.
Exactly.
And what about the inconsistencies this creates with state policies?
Yeah.
You mentioned over 20 states allow X on driver's licenses.
Right. So now you have this situation where someone might have a driver's license that accurately reflects their gender identity,
Right.
but their passport says something different.
Right.
That can lead to all sorts of confusion and problems when they're trying to just prove their identity.
Imagine trying to open a bank account or rent an apartment with mismatched documents.
Yes.
It's like having two different identities depending on what piece of ID you're showing.
And it's not just government documents either.
Oh, really?
Many businesses have also become more inclusive,
Okay.
offering X as a gender option.
Okay.
So you see airlines, banks, even social media platforms,
Wow.
they're increasingly recognizing the need to be more inclusive of gender diversity.
But then you have the federal government seemingly going in the opposite direction. It sends such a mixed message to individuals and to businesses that are trying to do the right thing.
It creates this sense of whiplash, and it highlights the need for greater consistency across different levels of government and even within the private sector.
It's like we're taking one step forward and two steps back. It makes me wonder, are there any potential economic implications to all of this? Could this decision actually hurt the U.S. economy?
It's certainly possible.
How so?
Think about tourism, for example. If the U.S. is seen as less welcoming to LGBTQ plus individuals, it could deter people from visiting or choosing to hold conferences and events here.
Okay.
And that could translate into lost revenue
Yeah.
for businesses and for the economy as a whole.
So this decision could have ripple effects
Right.
that go far beyond just the individuals who are directly impacted.
It really underscores how interconnected these issues are.
Yeah.
It's not just about individual rights or legal technicalities.
Right.
It's about how these decisions shape our society,
Right.
our economy, and our place in the world.
You've hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
It's about creating a world that's both just and prosperous, where everyone has the opportunity to thrive and contribute their talent.
Contribute their talents.
I love that vision.
Yeah.
But achieving it requires us to be thoughtful, to be aware of the consequences of our actions, and to be willing to challenge the status quo when it's no longer serving us.
Absolutely.
And with that, I think it's time to bring it back to our listener.
Okay. And talk about what all of this means for them personally. So we've really gone deep on this passport decision, haven't we?
We have.
All those different angles, the legal, the social, the global stage, the economic ripples.
It's a lot.
It is.
Yeah.
But, I always want to make sure our deep dives are useful, not just fascinating.
Right.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now?
That's the question, isn't it?
It is.
For me, I think the takeaway is kind of twofold.
Okay.
Awareness and action.
Okay, I like it.
First, be aware that this policy creates really real challenges for non-binary people.
Yeah.
It's not just about a letter on a document.
Right.
This affects their daily lives.
Yeah.
Their travel, their sense of being acknowledged for who they truly are.
It's about empathy, isn't it?
Yeah.
Putting yourself in their shoes.
Exactly.
Even if your own gender identity isn't in question. It helps us grasp why this matters so much to so many people.
And then comes action.
You might think, well, I'm not directly affected. So what can I do?
Yeah.
But we all have a role in advocating for more inclusive policies.
So give us some concrete examples.
Sure.
How can someone listening take what they've learned here and turn it into positive change?
It starts with education.
Okay.
Talk to your friends, your family, your colleagues about what you've learned in this deep dive.
Yeah.
Share the stories, the statistics, the complexities that we've been discussing. The more people understand this issue, the more likely we are to actually see real change.
Knowledge is power.
It is.
But it's the application of that knowledge that creates change.
For sure.
What else can our listeners do?
You can support organizations working on the front lines for transgender and non-binary rights.
Okay.
There are incredible groups out there advocating, providing resources, and fighting for legal change.
Right.
Your donations, your volunteer hours, even just spreading awareness about their work can have a huge impact.
And let's not forget the power of our voices as citizens.
Contact your elected officials. Let them know this issue matters to you, that you support policies that affirm and protect the rights of all individuals.
Right.
Believe it or not, those phone calls, those emails, they do make a difference.
It's about making our voices heard, isn't it?
It is.
Reminding those in power that their decisions have real-world consequences.
They do.
Okay, so we've got awareness, we've got action, but let's end this deep dive on a forward-looking note.
Okay.
If you could wave a magic wand and redesign that whole system for identity documents, passports, driver's licenses, all of that, what would it look like?
That's a great question.
In a truly inclusive and practical way.
For me, it starts with acknowledging that gender is complex and evolving.
Yeah.
A truly inclusive system would need to move beyond the limitations of just a binary male-female framework.
So dishing the boxes altogether.
Precisely. We need a system that allows for a wider range of gender identities to be represented accurately. And from a practical standpoint, we need consistency. No more patchwork of policies that vary from state to state or clash with international standards.
Imagine a world where your identity is recognized and respected wherever you go, no matter what document you're presenting.
That's powerful.
It is.
It is.
That's what the deep dive is all about, isn't it?
Yeah.
Exploring complex topics, unpacking all the nuances, and hopefully leaving you with more knowledge and more questions.
Yeah, questions.
We've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
But the conversation doesn't end here.
It doesn't.
Keep learning, keep questioning, and most importantly, keep advocating for a world that is inclusive and affirming for everyone.
Beautifully said.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
See you next time.
For another fascinating journey into the heart of the matter.